Keanu Reeves stepped out of the cafe, adjusting the collar of his jacket as the cool autumn breeze brushed against his face. The streets of Los Angeles were alive with the evening rush. Cars honked impatiently, pedestrians weaved through crosswalks, and streetlights flickered on as the sun dipped below the skyline. He had spent the past hour in quiet solitude, sipping his coffee and watching life unfold outside the window, lost in thought. But as he took a step onto the sidewalk, a sight caught his attention. An elderly woman stood at the corner, struggling with several large grocery bags. Her frail hands trembled under the weight, and the bags sagged dangerously as if they might tear at any moment. People walked past her, some glancing in her direction, but quickly averting their eyes. No one stopped. No one offered help. The woman, with a determined yet exhausted look on her face, adjusted her grip and took a shaky step forward. Keanu hesitated for only a second before moving toward her. "Here, let me help you," he said, his voice warm and genuine. The woman looked up, startled by the sudden kindness. Her eyes, clouded with age, but still sharp with wisdom, studied him for a moment. Recognition flickered across her face, but she said nothing about it. Instead, she gave him a small, grateful smile. "Oh dear, that's very kind of you. These bags are heavier than I thought." Keanu took two of the largest bags from her hands, and she immediately let out a breath of relief. "Where are you headed?" he asked, adjusting his grip. "Just a few blocks down," she said, pointing down the street. "My apartment's right above the little bookstore." He nodded and fell into step beside her. As they walked, the city hummed around them. The rhythmic tapping of shoes on pavement, the distant sound of a saxophone from a street performer, the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery. All of it blended into the background of their quiet conversation. "My name's Eleanor," the woman said after a moment. "I don't usually accept help from strangers, but I suppose sometimes we don't have a choice." Keanu smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Eleanor. And I think we always have a choice. Sometimes choosing to let someone help is just as important as offering help." She chuckled. "That's quite a perspective. You remind me of someone, but I can't quite put my finger on it." He didn't say anything, just smiled as they turned the corner. The bookstore she had mentioned came into view, its old-fashioned wooden sign swaying slightly in the breeze. Above it, a narrow metal staircase led to the second floor. Eleanor sighed as she looked up. "That staircase gets steeper every year." Without hesitation, Keanu motioned toward the stairs. "I'll carry these up for you." The climb was short but steep. Eleanor followed behind him, gripping the railing tightly. When they reached her door, she fumbled with her keys for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the apartment was small but cozy, lined with bookshelves that nearly reached the ceiling. A floral-patterned couch sat in the center of the room, covered with a handmade quilt. The air smelled of lavender and old paper. "You can set them on the counter, dear," she said, motioning toward the tiny kitchen. Keanu placed the bags down carefully, then turned to face her. "Would you like some tea?" Eleanor asked, already moving toward the kettle. He hesitated for a moment, but something about her presence felt familiar, almost comforting. "I'd love some," he said, taking a seat at the small wooden table by the window. As she prepared the tea, she glanced at him. "Tell me, do you often go around helping strangers?" Keanu shrugged. "I try to. Kindness doesn't cost anything." Eleanor nodded, pouring hot water into two porcelain cups. "That's true, but not everyone sees it that way. I used to believe that one good deed could change the course of someone's life. Then life happened." He noticed the distant look in her eyes as she placed the cup in front of him. "What do you mean?" She sighed and settled into the chair across from him. "Oh, it's a long story, and I don't want to bore you with an old woman's regrets." Keanu shook his head. "I have time." She studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether to trust him with the truth. Finally, she let out a small chuckle. "You remind me so much of my son." The words hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken emotion. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Your son. Eleanor ran a finger along the rim of her cup. He was a lot like you, always willing to help others, always seeing the good in people. He had the kindest heart. She paused. But the world wasn't always kind to him. Keanu remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. He passed away many years ago, she said, her voice quieter now. It was an accident, one of those things you never expect, never see coming. A moment of silence stretched between them. Outside, the city continued its symphony, oblivious to the quiet sorrow in the little apartment. I'm so sorry, Keanu said softly. Eleanor gave him a small, sad smile. Thank you, dear. It was a long time ago, but some wounds never fully heal. He nodded, understanding all too well the weight of loss. She took a sip of her tea and exhaled. But enough about me. What about you? You seem like a man with stories of your own. Keanu chuckled. Maybe. But I think yours is more important right now. Eleanor smiled, appreciating the sincerity in his voice. You know, you really are quite different from most people. He shrugged. I just believe in listening. Everyone has a story that deserves to be heard. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. Well then, perhaps fate had a reason for sending you my way today. Keanu lifted his cup in a silent toast. Maybe it did. Outside, the streetlights flickered as the night deepened. What had begun as a simple act of kindness was turning into something much more, a meeting that neither of them would forget. And neither of them knew that this encounter was just the beginning of something far greater than they could have imagined. Keanu sat at Eleanor's small wooden table, his fingers wrapped around the warm porcelain cup as he listened to the steady ticking of a clock on the wall. The air in the apartment was heavy with the scent of lavender and old books, but there was something else, too, a quiet melancholy that clung to the space like an unspoken memory. Eleanor's eyes, though kind, carried the weight of years gone by, of losses endured, and of stories left untold. She sat across from him, her hands resting gently on the table, as if steadying herself before speaking again. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn. What had started as a simple act of carrying groceries had unfolded into something much deeper, something neither of them had planned. She sighed, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. It's funny, you know, she said after a long pause. The way life brings people into our path when we least expect it. Keanu nodded, understanding what she meant without needing to say anything. He had always believed in the quiet, unspoken connections between people, the moments that seemed insignificant at first, but later proved to be anything but. Eleanor glanced out the window, her gaze distant. You remind me so much of him, she murmured. My son, I mean. The way you carry yourself, the way you speak. It's uncanny. Keanu remained silent, letting her gather her thoughts. He was a good boy, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. Always looking out for others, always trying to do the right thing. Even when the world wasn't kind to him, he never let it change him. She paused, taking a slow sip of her tea. But kindness doesn't always protect you from the cruelty of life. A silence settled between them, the weight of her words pressing into the space they shared. Keanu knew loss. He understood it in a way few people did, and he knew there were no words that could take away the ache of losing someone you love. But he also knew that sometimes all the person needed was someone to listen. Eleanor set her cup down with a quiet clink. He wanted to be a writer, she said, a small, wistful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Had a notebook he carried everywhere, always scribbling down ideas, always dreaming about the stories he'd tell one day. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I used to think he'd change the world with his words. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. What happened? She hesitated, as if the words were too painful to say out loud. Then, after a long pause, she met his gaze. He disappeared. Keanu's grip tightened around his cup. Disappeared. Eleanor nodded slowly. One day, he just vanished. No warning, No note. 1 minute he was here, the next, he was gone. Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. The police called it a runaway case at first. Said he probably left on his own. She scoffed, a bitter edge creeping into her tone. But I knew my son. He wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. He wouldn't have just walked away from everything. Keanu felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unsettling about the way she said it, something that made his stomach tighten. He had met many people throughout his life, had heard many stories, but this one felt different. Eleanor took a deep breath, composing herself. I spent years looking for him, calling hospitals, visiting shelters, following any lead I could find. But it was like he had vanished into thin air. She shook her head. Eventually, people stopped asking, stopped caring. They told me to move on, to accept that he was gone. Keanu knew that kind of pain, the kind that lingered, that refused to be buried no matter how much time passed. He could hear it in her voice, in the way she carried herself. She had never stopped hoping, never stopped searching, even when the rest of the world had given up. I kept his room exactly the way he left it, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. His notebooks, his books, his old jacket hanging by the door. Some days I'd sit in there and read his stories, just to feel close to him again. Keanu glanced around the small apartment, suddenly aware of the presence of something unseen, a ghost of a boy who had once lived there, whose absence still echoed through the walls. I'm sorry, Eleanor said suddenly, shaking her head as if to clear her thoughts. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. You don't need to listen to an old woman's sorrow. Keanu met her gaze, his voice steady. I want to. She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, a look of quiet gratitude in her eyes. Most people don't. He understood. Most people were afraid of grief, of stories without happy endings, but Keanu had never shied away from them. He knew that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was simply be there. Eleanor pushed back her chair and stood. There's something I want to show you. Keanu followed her as she walked down a narrow hallway, stopping in front of a closed door. Her fingers hesitated on the doorknob for a moment before she pushed it open. Inside, the room was frozen in time. A small wooden desk sat beneath the window, covered in notebooks and loose sheets of paper. A bookshelf lined the wall, filled with novels, old journals, and a few framed photographs. A jacket hung on the back of the chair, untouched, as if waiting for its owner to return. Eleanor stepped inside and picked up one of the notebooks. She ran her fingers over the cover, lost in thought. Then she turned to Keanu and held it out to him. This was his, she said softly. His stories, his dreams, everything he wanted to share with the world. Keanu took the notebook carefully, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was neat but filled with passion, each word spilling onto the paper with urgency. He could feel the weight of the boy's dreams in every line, could almost hear his voice through the ink. Eleanor watched him, her expression unreadable. I don't know why, but I feel like you were meant to see this. Keanu looked up at her, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He didn't know what it was. Fate, coincidence, something more. But he knew that this moment, this meeting, was not an accident. He closed the notebook gently. What was his name? Eleanor's lips trembled slightly before she whispered, Matthew. The name hung in the air, filling the silence between them. Keanu glanced back down at the notebook, a thought forming in his mind. He didn't know where this would lead, but one thing was certain. This story was far from over. Keanu sat in Eleanor's dimly lit living room, the weight of the notebook heavy in his hands. The old, worn cover was smooth from years of handling, its pages filled with the thoughts and dreams of a boy who had vanished without a trace. The soft hum of the city outside filtered through the window, distant yet ever present, as if reminding them that the world had continued moving forward despite the unanswered questions that had anchored Eleanor's heart to the past. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, watching him closely. There was something in her gaze, a quiet hopefulness, fragile yet persistent, as if she were waiting for him to say something that would make sense of the pain she had carried for so long. Keanu slowly turned the pages, scanning the words carefully. Matthew had been a storyteller, each sentence bold with passion, the kind that only came from someone who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. His stories weren't just fiction. They were filled with longing, with messages of hope and kindness, with characters who fought against the odds to make a difference. There was something eerily familiar about them, as if Keanu had read them before, even though he knew he hadn't. "How old was he when he disappeared?" Keanu asked, his voice gentle. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of her dress. "He was 21. Just a boy, really." She let out a small, bittersweet chuckle, though he never liked being called that. He always thought of himself as much older than he was. "An old soul, I suppose." Keanu nodded, understanding the sentiment. Some people carried a weight far beyond their years, their spirits shaped by something unspoken. Eleanor glanced toward the window, lost in thought. "He used to sit right where you are now," she murmured. "Late into the night, writing by candlelight when he thought I was asleep. He never wanted to disturb me, but I could always hear the scratching of his pen against the paper." Her lips curled into a faint smile. It was the sound of his dreams coming to life. Keanu flipped to another page. This one was different. Unlike the others, which were filled with carefully constructed stories, this page contained something else entirely, a message hastily written, almost as if Matthew had been in a rush. "If something happens to me, don't believe what they say. The truth is in the stories." Keanu's brow furrowed as he reread the words. There was something cryptic about the way it was written, something that sent a chill down his spine. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "did Matthew ever mention being in trouble?" She blinked, her expression shifting. "What do you mean?" Keanu hesitated before handing her the notebook. She took it slowly, her eyes scanning the words. A sharp intake of breath escaped her lips. "I've never seen this before," she whispered. "I thought I had read everything he wrote. But this—" Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, she simply stared at the page, as if willing it to reveal its secrets. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Do you think he was afraid of something?" Eleanor swallowed, her fingers trembling slightly as she closed the notebook. "He never told me if he was. But there were things I didn't understand at the time. Days when he seemed distant, lost in thought. He'd come home late sometimes, always saying he had been writing at the park. But there was something in his eyes, something haunted." Keanu absorbed her words, feeling the weight of an unseen presence in the room. It was as if Matthew's story had never truly ended, as if it had been waiting all these years for someone to pick up the pieces and put them together. "Did the police ever find anything?" Keanu asked. Eleanor shook her head. "No, they barely even searched. They told me that young men leave home all the time, that he had probably run off to chase some dream and would return when he was ready." Her voice turned bitter. "But he never did. And I know in my heart that he didn't just leave." Keanu tapped his fingers against the table, thinking. Something about this didn't sit right with him. A young man full of dreams, a mysterious note hidden within his writings, a disappearance that had never been explained. There were too many loose ends. He stood up suddenly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "Eleanor," he said, his voice steady, "I want to help you." She looked up at him, startled. "Help me?" Keanu nodded. "Matthew's story isn't over. If there's even the slightest chance that we can find out what happened to him, I want to try." Eleanor's lips parted slightly in shock. But then, slowly, something flickered in her eyes, something that had long been buried beneath years of grief and unanswered questions. "Why would you do that?" she asked softly. Keanu met her gaze. "Because if it were my loved one, I'd want someone to do the same." A silence stretched between them before Eleanor finally nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "There's one more thing," she said hesitantly. "Something I never told anyone." Keanu sat back down, listening intently. A few days before Matthew disappeared, I overheard a phone call, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but he sounded upset. He kept saying that he didn't want to be involved in something, that he was just a writer, not a part of whatever they were planning. Keanu's pulse quickened. Did he mention any names? Eleanor shook her head. No, but when he hung up, he looked pale, like he had just seen a ghost. She wiped at her eyes, taking a deep breath. I asked him if he was all right, and he smiled, told me not to worry. Her voice broke slightly. That was the last real conversation we had before he disappeared. Keanu clenched his jaw. Something was wrong here. This wasn't just a case of someone running away. There was more to this story, something hidden beneath the surface. He glanced down at the notebook once more, running his fingers over the pages. If Matthew had left a clue, it would be here, buried within his words. And Keanu was determined to find it. The night stretched on, but for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Keanu sat in his dimly lit apartment later that night, the worn notebook resting on the table before him. A single lamp cast a soft glow over the pages, illuminating the inked words that had been written so many years ago. He flipped through them carefully, absorbing Matthew's stories, searching for anything at all, that could point him toward the truth. The message Matthew had scrawled in a moment of urgency haunted Keanu's mind. If something happens to me, don't believe what they say. The truth is in the stories. Keanu exhaled slowly, rubbing his fingers across the stubble on his jaw. He had read through most of the notebook already, but nothing stood out, at least not yet. The stories were vivid, imaginative, filled with adventure and emotion. But what if they weren't just stories? What if they were something more? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. This whole thing felt like a mystery novel come to life, an unsolved case wrapped in layers of fiction, waiting for someone to peel back the truth. But where was he supposed to start? His eyes drifted back to the notebook. He needed to read more closely. If Matthew had hidden something in his stories, Keanu had to find it. Turning the page, he landed on one of the longer stories, titled The Man Who Knew Too Much. He frowned. There was something different about this one. The handwriting seemed more rushed, as if Matthew had written it in a hurry, his thoughts spilling onto the page faster than his pen could keep up. Keanu read the opening lines. He didn't ask for the information. He never wanted to know. But once the truth was in his hands, he understood one thing. There was no turning back. A chill ran down Keanu's spine. The story followed a young writer, an aspiring journalist, who accidentally uncovered something dangerous, something he was never meant to see. He didn't know who to trust. He was being watched. And the more he tried to forget, the more the truth followed him. Keanu's grip on the notebook tightened. This wasn't just a story. It was Matthew's story. He skimmed further, reading faster, trying to make sense of it. The protagonist, clearly a stand-in for Matthew, mentioned a meeting, a conversation with someone who had warned him to stay away. If you keep digging, they'll come for you. This isn't a game. Walk away before it's too late. Keanu's pulse quickened. Who was they? And what had Matthew found that made him feel so threatened? He flipped another page, scanning for more clues. Toward the end of the story, the protagonist wrote something that made Keanu pause. If anything happens to me, look where the water meets the trees. Keanu frowned, tapping his fingers against the table. Was this another clue? A real location, disguised as part of the story? His mind raced, thinking back to his conversation with Eleanor. Matthew had spent a lot of time writing in the park. Could this be a reference to that? A specific place within the park where water and trees met. He needed to find out. The next morning, Keanu arrived at Eleanor's apartment, just as the sun was rising. She opened the door, surprised to see him so early, but she let him in without question. I think I found something, he said, holding up the notebook. Eleanor's eyes widened. What is it? He flipped to the passage, pointing to the line that had caught his attention. "Look where the water meets the trees. Does that mean anything to you?" Eleanor furrowed her brow, reading the words carefully. Then, slowly, her expression changed, recognition flickering in her gaze. "There's a place," she murmured, "in the park where Matthew used to write. It's a small pond, surrounded by trees. He always loved sitting there." Keanu felt his heart pound. "Then that's where we need to go." Eleanor hesitated. "Keanu, it's been years. If there was anything to find, it would be gone by now." "Maybe," he admitted, "but if there's even the slightest chance that he left something behind, we have to check." She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right, let's go." The two of them arrived at the park just as the morning light cast a golden glow over the landscape. It was quiet, peaceful, just as Keanu imagined it must have been when Matthew used to sit there, lost in his stories. Eleanor led him toward the pond, her pace steady but cautious. When they reached the water's edge, she stopped, looking around. "This is it," she said softly. "This is where he spent most of his time." Keanu scanned the area, his eyes moving over the benches, the rocks, the trees that lined the water's edge. If Matthew had left something behind, it wouldn't have been obvious. He would have hidden it. He stepped closer to one of the larger trees near the water, examining its base. There was nothing unusual, just damp earth and fallen leaves. Then, his gaze shifted to a nearby rock formation. Something about it caught his attention. The stones looked deliberately arranged, as if they had been placed there rather than naturally settled. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he knelt and began moving the stones aside. At first, there was nothing but dirt. But then, beneath the final layer of rocks, he saw it. A small rusted tin box. Keanu reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted it from the earth. Eleanor gasped softly, her hands covering her mouth. With careful precision, Keanu pried the lid open. Inside, there were several folded sheets of paper, yellowed with age, but still intact. He pulled one out and unfolded it. It was a letter. His eyes scanned the words, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "If you're reading this, then you're looking for the truth. I don't know how much time I have left, but I need someone to know what I found. This wasn't an accident. They don't want me to talk, but I can't stay silent. If something happens to me, tell my story. Please." Keanu's hands tightened around the paper. Matthew had known he was in danger. And now, after all these years, Keanu was holding the proof. Eleanor's voice broke the silence. "Keanu, what does it say?" He looked up at her, his expression grim. "It says Matthew didn't run away." Eleanor's breath caught. He was taken. Keanu stared at the letter, the weight of Matthew's words pressing heavily against his chest. The truth had been buried for years, hidden beneath stone and soil, waiting for someone to find it. And now, after all this time, he held it in his hands. Eleanor trembled beside him, her fingers hovering just above the rusted tin box as if she were afraid to touch it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had spent years believing that her son had simply vanished, that there were no answers to be found. But now she knew the truth. Keanu carefully unfolded the rest of the papers. Some were hastily written notes, others full pages of what appeared to be journal entries. They were difficult to read at first, the ink smudged in places, the handwriting rushed and uneven. But as Keanu scanned the words, a pattern began to emerge. Matthew had been afraid. In entry after entry, he described an encounter with a man, someone he had met by chance, someone who had told him something he was never supposed to know. The details were scattered, fragmented, as if Matthew had been writing quickly, trying to get his thoughts down before they slipped away. Keanu read one particular passage aloud. "He told me there was something bigger happening, that people had disappeared before, that no one asked questions because they were afraid of the answers. I didn't believe him at first. I thought he was just another conspiracy theorist, someone who saw shadows where there were none. But then he showed me something real. I wish I had never seen it, because now I can't look away." Eleanor let out a sharp breath, her hand gripping Keanu's arm. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Keanu shook his head slowly, rereading the passage. "It means Matthew found something that put his life in danger." He turned to another page, scanning for more clues. "He said they were watching him, that they watch everyone who gets too close." I didn't believe him until I noticed it too. The same car, parked near my apartment. The same man sitting outside the cafe when I went to write. I told myself it was a coincidence, but it's not. I know it's not. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to trust. Keanu clenched his jaw. This wasn't just paranoia. Matthew had been right to be afraid. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. He knew he was being followed. Keanu nodded, his mind racing. If Matthew had written this down, it meant he had tried to leave a record, a trail for someone to follow. But why hadn't anyone found it before now? Had no one searched for him? Or had someone been trying to make sure that his story was never told? He turned to the final page. It was the shortest entry of them all, written with shaking hands. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I don't know how much time I have left, but I need you to know. I didn't run. I didn't leave. They came for me. And if they find this, they'll come for you too. Please, don't let them bury the truth." A heavy silence settled between them. Eleanor's breathing was uneven. She had spent years waiting for an answer, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Keanu carefully folded the pages and placed them back in the tin. His mind was already working, thinking of the next steps. This wasn't over. Matthew's story hadn't ended with his disappearance. It was still unfolding, and now Keanu was part of it. "We have to go to the police," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice firm despite the tremble in it. Keanu hesitated. He wanted to believe that the police would help, but if Matthew had been silenced, there was no guarantee that they hadn't already turned a blind eye. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "if Matthew was right, if someone made him disappear, then we don't know who we can trust." She swallowed hard, nodding slightly. "Then what do we do?" Keanu looked down at the tin, his grip tightening. "We find out what he knew. We follow his trail. If he left clues, we piece them together." Eleanor looked up at him, desperation in her eyes. "What if it's dangerous?" Keanu met her gaze, unwavering. "Then that means we're getting close to the truth." They left the park quickly, Keanu tucking the tin securely into his jacket. As they walked toward the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. A cold prickle ran down his spine, but he forced himself to stay calm. They needed a plan. Once they returned to Eleanor's apartment, they spread Matthew's notes out across the table, trying to make sense of them. "There has to be a connection," Keanu murmured, running his fingers over the pages. "Something he discovered. Something someone didn't want him to talk about." Eleanor reached for one of the notes. "This part, where he mentions the man who warned him. Do you think that person might still be around?" Keanu considered it. If Matthew had met someone who knew too much, that person might have been silenced as well. Or they might still be out there, afraid to talk. "We need to find out who he was," Keanu said. "Did Matthew have any close friends? Anyone he trusted?" Eleanor's brow furrowed in thought. There was one. A man named Daniel. They used to write together sometimes. "I haven't spoken to him in years, but if anyone knows something, it might be him." Keanu nodded. "Do you know where he is now?" She hesitated, then stood and walked to a drawer in the corner of the room. She rifled through it for a moment before pulling out a small notebook. Flipping through the pages, she finally stopped and pointed to a name and number. "Daniel Carter," she said. "He used to live a few blocks from here." Keanu took the notebook and studied the address. "If he's still around," Keanu said, "he might be the only person who can help us figure out what really happened to Matthew." Eleanor exhaled shakily. "Do you think he'll talk to us?" Keanu closed the notebook and looked her in the eyes. There's only one way to find out. As they prepared to leave, Keanu took one last glance at the rusted tin box. Matthew had left a message for the world, a message that had remained hidden for too long. But now, the truth was finally coming to light, and Keanu wasn't going to stop until he uncovered every last piece of it. Keanu and Eleanor stood outside the small, unassuming apartment building, staring up at the worn brick exterior. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights flickering as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had taken them nearly an hour to track down Daniel Carter's last known address, but now that they were here, a heavy uncertainty lingered in the air. Eleanor clutched her coat tighter around her, glancing nervously at Keanu. What if he doesn't remember anything? Or worse, what if he's scared to talk? Keanu turned to her, his expression calm but firm. If Matthew trusted him, then he must have known something. We just have to get him to open up. Eleanor nodded hesitantly, and together they walked up the steps to the front door. Keanu knocked twice, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. For a long moment, there was no response. Then the faint sound of footsteps. A shadow moved behind the peephole, and the door creaked open an inch, a chain locking it in place. A wary pair of eyes peered through the gap. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice rough from years of smoking. Keanu took a step forward. "We're looking for Daniel Carter." Silence. The man hesitated, his fingers twitching against the doorframe. He studied them both for a long moment before finally unlatching the chain and opening the door just enough to let them in. "Inside," he muttered. Quickly, Keanu and Eleanor exchanged glances before stepping into the dimly lit apartment. The place was small and cluttered, stacks of old newspapers and books piled against the walls. A desk sat in the corner, covered in papers, a half-empty cup of coffee long gone cold beside them. The man, Daniel, closed the door behind them and turned, his expression guarded. "I haven't heard that name in a long time," he said, his voice low. "Why are you looking for me?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about Matthew." Daniel flinched at the name, his jaw tightening. He ran a hand through his graying hair and let out a heavy sigh. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. "If you're asking about Matthew, that means you're already in too deep." Keanu took out the rusted tin box and set it on the table. "We found this," he said. "It was buried near the pond where Matthew used to write. He left behind notes, letters, warnings." Daniel stared at the box as if it were something radioactive. He didn't touch it, but Keanu saw the fear in his eyes. He knew, Daniel murmured, almost to himself. "I told him to stop. I told him it wasn't worth it." Keanu leaned forward. What wasn't worth it? Daniel hesitated, his fingers curling into fists. "Matthew was digging into something he shouldn't have," he said finally. "Something dangerous." Eleanor's breath hitched. But what was it? What did he find? Daniel rubbed his face, looking exhausted. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He was investigating disappearances. Keanu's stomach tightened. Disappearances. Daniel nodded. Not just anyone. People who had stumbled onto the wrong information. Journalists, whistleblowers, activists. They all had something in common. They asked too many questions, and then, one by one, they'd vanished. Eleanor covered her mouth, her eyes wide. "Are you saying Matthew was one of them?" Daniel exhaled sharply. He started looking into one case. Just one. A writer who disappeared without a trace. But the more he looked, the more connections he found. He realized it wasn't just one person. It was dozens. And then he realized he was being watched. Keanu clenched his fists. Who was behind it? Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. I wish I did. But whoever they are, they're powerful. And they don't leave loose ends." Silence settled over the room. Keanu could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on them. Matthew hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had uncovered something massive. something that had cost him his life. Eleanor's voice trembled. "Why didn't you say anything?" Daniel looked away. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "Matthew tried to warn me, but I didn't listen. And then, one night, I came home to find my apartment ransacked. My notes were gone. My computer wiped. It was a message. Stop asking questions, or you'll be next." Keanu studied him carefully. "And you just let it go." Daniel's expression darkened. "I had no choice." Keanu's mind raced. If Matthew had been onto something this big, there had to be more clues, more pieces of the puzzle. His notes had given them breadcrumbs, but they needed something solid. He turned to Daniel. "Do you still have any of your research? Anything at all?" Daniel hesitated. "I burned most of it," he admitted. "But there's one thing I kept." He walked to a bookshelf, reaching behind a row of novels. After a moment, he pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and handed it to Keanu. "This was Matthew's," he said. "He gave it to me the night before he disappeared. Told me to keep it safe." Keanu carefully opened the notebook. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and names. Some were circled, others crossed out. In the margins, Matthew had scribbled questions, desperate, urgent. But one name stood out. It was underlined 3 times, with a single note written beside it. "He knows everything." Keanu turned to Daniel. "Who is this?" Daniel swallowed hard. "His name is Carter Hayes. He used to be a reporter. He was investigating the same thing Matthew was, until he disappeared." Eleanor's hands trembled. "Then how do we find him?" Daniel looked at them, both grimly. "If he's still alive," he said, "he's in hiding. But if you want to know the truth, he's your only chance." Keanu stared down at the name, determination settling in his chest. Matthew had started this search for the truth. Now it was Keanu's turn to finish it. Keanu sat in the dimly lit apartment, flipping through the pages of Matthew's notebook, his mind racing with possibilities. The name Carter Hayes stared back at him, underlined 3 times. If Matthew believed this man knew everything, then he was the key to unlocking the truth. The problem was, finding him wouldn't be easy. Daniel paced across the small living room, rubbing his temples. "You don't just find a man like Carter Hayes," he muttered. "If he's still alive, he's spent years making sure no one can." Eleanor sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "There has to be a way," she said, desperation edging her voice. "Matthew got close to him, didn't he?" Daniel stopped pacing and exhaled sharply. Matthew never met him in person. He only communicated through burner phones and encrypted emails. The last time he heard from him was a few days before he disappeared. Keanu leaned forward. "Do you have any of those emails? Anything that could help us trace him?" Daniel hesitated before walking to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old, battered laptop. "They wiped my hard drive, but I kept a backup," he admitted. He powered it on, the screen flickering to life. As he navigated through the files, Keanu and Eleanor watched in silence. Finally, Daniel found what he was looking for. He turned the screen toward them. The email was brief, the words sharp and urgent. "They know about you. You need to disappear. If I don't respond again, assume the worst. And if you're smart, you'll stop digging." Keanu clenched his jaw. He was running. Daniel nodded. "And if he's still alive, he's been running ever since." Keanu studied the email header. "The sender's IP address. Can we trace it?" Daniel shook his head. He was too careful. "But there's something else. Look at the location tag." Keanu narrowed his eyes, scanning the metadata. The email had been sent from a public Wi-Fi network, one registered to a small motel just outside of Seattle. Eleanor sat up straighter. "That's something. If we can find the last place he was, maybe we can find where he went next." Keanu nodded. "We don't have a choice. We have to go there." The drive to Seattle was tense and silent. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the passing headlights, lost in thought. Keanu focused on the road, his mind working through every possible scenario. If Carter Hayes was still alive, they had to convince him to talk. If he wasn't, then Matthew's case might never be solved. When they finally reached the rundown motel, the parking lot was nearly empty. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Keanu parked the car and took a deep breath. "Stay close," he said. They stepped into the motel's front office, where a tired-looking clerk barely glanced up from his newspaper. Keanu approached the counter, keeping his voice calm and measured. "We're looking for someone who might have stayed here a while back," he said. The clerk sighed, clearly uninterested. "Lots of people stay here." Keanu pulled out his phone and showed him the email's timestamp. Around this date, he would have been alone, probably paranoid, maybe paying in cash. The clerk squinted at the screen, then sighed again, shuffling through an old logbook. After a moment, he tapped a line with his pen. "Had a guy here around that time," he said. "Paid cash, kept to himself." Keanu's heart pounded. "Do you remember his name?" The clerk shrugged. "He used a fake one. But I remember he asked about another motel, one further out, near the woods. Said he needed somewhere quieter." Eleanor's breath caught. "Do you remember which one?" The clerk nodded. "There's only one out that way. Eagle's Rest. But good luck finding him. If he didn't want to be found, he's long gone." Keanu exchanged a glance with Eleanor before turning back to the clerk. "Thanks." They walked back to the car, the weight of their next move settling over them. Daniel's voice crackled over the phone when Keanu called him. "Eagle's Rest," he repeated. "That place is in the middle of nowhere. If he's still out there, he's off the grid completely." Keanu tightened his grip on the wheel. "Then we're going off the grid too." The drive to Eagle's Rest was long and winding, the roads turning from pavement to dirt the farther they went. Towering trees loomed over them, their branches casting shifting shadows under the moonlight. When they finally arrived, the motel looked even more desolate than the last. A single porch light flickered near the entrance, barely illuminating the row of cabins. Keanu pulled up to the front office and stepped inside. An older man sat behind the counter, watching a static-filled television. He barely reacted when Keanu approached. "Looking for someone," Keanu said, keeping his tone neutral. "Might have stayed here a while back." The old man took a slow sip of coffee. "People come and go." Keanu pulled out his wallet and slid a few bills across the counter. The man eyed the money before leaning back in his chair. "Cabin 7, he muttered. "Been rented for months. No one ever sees the guy." Keanu nodded. "Thanks." He and Eleanor stepped back outside, the night air crisp against their skin. "This is it," Eleanor whispered. Keanu approached Cabin 7, his footsteps silent on the dirt path. He knocked once. Silence. Then a faint rustling inside. Keanu knocked again. Carter Hayes. More silence. Then a voice, hoarse and cautious. "Go away." Keanu didn't move. "Matthew sent us." A long pause. Then slow, deliberate footsteps approached the door. The lock clicked, and the door opened an inch. A pair of wary eyes peered through the gap. Carter Hayes was older than Keanu expected, his face lined with exhaustion and fear. "I don't know you," he said flatly. Keanu held up Matthew's notebook. "But you knew him." Carter's eyes flickered to the book, and something in his expression cracked. He exhaled shakily, then stepped back. "Inside," he muttered. Keanu and Eleanor followed him in, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Carter locked the door behind them, then turned, his eyes filled with something between fear and resignation. "I told Matthew to stop," he said quietly. "And now he's gone." Keanu's voice was steady. "But you're still here." Carter let out a bitter laugh. "For now." Keanu set the notebook on the table. "Then tell us what you know." Carter hesitated. Then, finally, he sat down, running a hand through his disheveled hair. They call themselves the Quiet Order, he said. They operate in the shadows. They erase people. They bury the truth. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Keanu leaned forward, and Matthew got too close. Carter nodded grimly. He found something. Something they didn't want the world to see. Keanu's pulse pounded. What was it? Carter's eyes darkened. The real question is, are you ready to die for the answer?